So you think the superbikes of today are extreme? Then check this out. A racing bike with no amenities, no brakes, no clutch, not even a reliable throttle. The 1912 Indian 8-valve Boardtrack racer was beautiful, fast, and often lethal.
In the early part of the 20th century, Boardtrack racing was huge. These heavily banked tracks, made from 2x4s laid on their side, offered a level of spectacle not seen since Roman times. Riders would race side by side at speeds on tracks up to 2 miles in length. And the bikes leaked oil like sieves, and one slip would fill your hide with splinters, or worse. It was insanely dangerous.
The Boardtrack races, they got tens of thousands of people. And those were daredevil guys. There is no safety nets. It's an extreme sport.
These guys were going 100 miles an hour, where nowadays that's an insane amount of speed. And this was a bike that looked like a bicycle with a motor in it. A lot of times, if somebody went down, that's when it got bad. Somebody might hit another bike. They didn't have the helmets they have nowadays. They had leather-like helmets.
These guys were amazing motorcycle riders to race these motorcycles at the speeds they did.
To compete in Boardtrack racing, you needed a lightning-fast, reliable, and relatively stable mount. The Indian 8-valve Boardtrack racer, offering a quantum leap in engine design, was the answer.
Yeah, the 8-valve, it's funny, you know, a lot of things aren't new today that we're doing. It's just they didn't know what they were doing or didn't have the metallurgy or didn't really understand what they were doing back then. But if you look at one of those bikes, I mean, just sitting there, it looks mean, it's fast, it's purpose-built. That bike was just, even today, I mean, you can cruise that bike at 60 miles an hour. It is an extreme machine. And Boardtrack racing back then, absolutely an extreme machine.
Extreme and beautiful. A red and white work of art. At a time when consumer motorcycles could be bought for $100, the 8-valve was available to a select few at the astronomical price of $350. Most machines were ridden either by factory riders or were loaned to promising privateers. And in its prime, nothing could touch it.
Did very well. It was blowing Harley away, let's put it that way, at the time, you know, with that motor. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, 112 miles an hour, if you can imagine, 112 miles an hour with no transmission, direct drive, incredible.
Based on the twin-cylinder engine Indian first introduced in 1907, the 8-valve was created strictly for competition purposes. Racers dueled handlebar to handlebar on skinny 2.5-inch tires. And remember, with no brakes. How did the Indian produce such bone-breaking speeds? Start with a 4-stroke 1,000cc twin-cylinder engine. But its secret sauce was in its exotic overhead valve configuration. 4 valves per cylinder, the technology used today. At the time, most motorcycles were using primitive inlet valves placed directly above the exhaust valve. The Indian's overhead valves and push rods were the most advanced factory parts of their day. For 1912, this was smoking technology. Indian 8-valve racers are extremely rare. Getting one out on a dirt track today? No way.
Once you get out there, and it's a little bit squirrely, but once you find your niche going around the track and get used to it, they ride pretty good. They're quick motorcycles. You can see when they came out with the 8-valve and the increased horsepower, you can see where it was almost too much motor for the motorcycle. And they were just almost a bicycle-type frame with a motor, and these motors kept getting bigger, but the frame and suspension was way behind the times.
The controls were rudimentary at best. Racers would often leave the throttle wide open and hit the kill switch for speed control. But Boardtrack accidents became so frequent that newspapers were calling for a ban. Then came the sport's darkest hour on September 8, 1912. 23-year-old Eddie Hasha, an Indian 8-valve racer known as the Texas Cyclone, began his 5-mile race at the Newark, New Jersey Motordrome in the lead. But on the third lap, his machine misfired, and it shot him up into the railing. Hasha struck the rail and rode it for about 100 feet, killing 4 boys who had been watching the race with their heads stuck through the gaps. Then the machine struck a large post, throwing Hasha to his death in the grandstand. His bike careened down and killed another rider back in the pack. It was one of the few cases in the history of the New York Times that motorcycling was front-page news.
After the terrible loss of life at Newark, the press began to call the board track racing motordromes murder drones. It marked the beginning of the end of the sport.
That was the death of the board track motordromes. The media got hold of it and ran with it, and it put an end to board track racing.
Board track racing went into a long decline. By 1924, most of the tracks had become inoperable due to the lack of interest in the sport. Though Indian would abandon the expensive overhead valve engine design in favor of side valves, the technology was solid and is universally applied today.
Racing basically is the leading edge for development of motorcycles or cars or whatever for the street. What they test and it works good on the track and it makes sense, it'll go into production. And that's how Indian and all the early motorcycles participated in the early racing.
And if you come across an Indian board track racer in your granddad's barn, padlock the doors.
Congratulations, because you've hit a home run, because they're so valuable now. I mean, anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000, depending on the machine and its history, etc.